Hello again. I'm going to read today from Stephen and Matilda's Civil War, Cousins of Anarchy, that covers the first civil war in England since the conquest, in which Empress Matilda, who was the daughter of Henry I, fought her cousin Stephen, who had taken the throne in the wake of her father's death. This passage comes just after the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, at which Stephen was captured, and when Matilda is on the verge of making herself Queen of England. Chapter 16. Empress Matilda. So difficult was it to reduce the Londoners to acquiescence that, although these proceedings took place, as I have said, immediately after Easter, it was not until a few days before the Nativity of St. John that they received the Empress. The Legatine Council held at Winchester had broken up on the 10th of April, but, as William of Malmesbury lamented, it was not until almost the feast of the Nativity of St. John on the 24th of June that Empress Matilda was permitted to enter London. It must have been frustrating for the Empress to be forced to enter into prolonged negotiations with her capital city just to be allowed to enter it. Control of London would be necessary for a coronation at Westminster Abbey, never mind the political need to hold the nation's capital. The Londoners were intransigent, though how long they could hold back the swelling tide is questionable. The delay might have been about extracting the maximum concessions possible from the Empress while they still held some of the cards, or even about hoping for King Stephen's fortunes to change. Either way, it was embarrassing and maddening for Empress Matilda, who needed to secure her tenuous hold on authority by being consecrated as Lady of the English. It was this that made Stephen's position unassailable, at least in the papal courts, and now she needed it too, as soon as possible. While she waited for London to agree to her arrival, Empress Matilda was not idle. She emulated Stephen's policy of decentralisation by creating her own set of earls to exercise local authority in her name. It's striking that one of Stephen's initiatives that had been condemned as desperate and backward was also enacted by the Empress at this point. It may have been a recognition that the uncertain times demanded it, but equally it could have been a popular and effective policy. The latter would explain Empress Matilda's willingness to adopt it rather than seeking to differentiate herself and follow policies more in line with those of her father. Baldwin de Redvers, who had been banished by Stephen and had attached himself to the Angevin cause almost immediately, was made Earl of Devon. William de Mohun was created Earl of Somerset, where his father had been High Sheriff. The troublesome Hugh Bigot became Earl of Norfolk, and Aubrey de Vere was made Earl of Oxford. One of the most significant confirmations, rather than new appointments, was that of Geoffrey de Mandeville. Geoffrey had been created Earl of Essex by Stephen around May 1140, and the king had returned estates in that county which Geoffrey had been deprived of by Henry I. Geoffrey seems, like many others, to have quickly recognised the need to become conspicuously aligned with the freshly victorious Empress Matilda. In turn, she could see in him the key to gaining control of London. Like his father William before him, Geoffrey had custody of the critical Tower of London. He was swiftly forgiven debts that his father had incurred to the crown, partly as a result of a huge fine imposed by Henry I after a prisoner had escaped from the Tower. The prisoner was Ranulph Flambert, Bishop of Durham. A principal servant of William II, he had been arrested on Henry I's accession on charges of embezzlement in 1100. Bishop Ranulph was the first inmate of the Tower of London, and he would become the first to escape it on the 3rd of February 1101. Popular legend explains that friends smuggled a long rope into the bishop, and after he managed to encourage his guards to get so drunk they passed out, he lowered himself from the window of his cell. Flambard was forced to flee to the continent, where he joined Henry's brother and enemy, Duke Robert of Normandy. He was eventually stripped of all his property and his bishopric. William, suspected by Henry I of some involvement, or at least of incompetence, was punished for the lapse in security. It was hardly an auspicious start to the Tower's later dark and formidable reputation as a prison. Like so many of the other central figures during this period, and during 1141 in particular, Geoffrey's precise role and his motives are difficult to untangle. One explanation of his actions is that he saw a chance to play the two sides off against each other in order to make the greatest possible gains for himself. Empress Matilda confirmed Geoffrey in the earldom Stephen had granted him, forgave his significant debts, and also appointed him hereditary sheriff of Essex, Hertfordshire, Middlesex, and London. He'd extracted a fabulous deal from his switch of allegiance, but like many others, he probably saw no real alternative as the summer of 1141 approached. Stephen was a prisoner, and Matilda was stepping ever closer to a coronation. Geoffrey placed himself at odds with the population of London, but perhaps did no more than make the best of the new political realities. Hindsight allows the suggestion that his actions were more cynical, that he understood his power in London and Empress Matilda's need for it, so he extracted all that he could before giving her aid. Even if that were the case, it's hard to blame him. A coup fell into the lap of Empress Matilda when Waller and Beaumont, Count of Moulins and Earl of Worcester, became a vassal of the Empress. The Beaumont twins were core pillars of Stephen's rule, and Walleran's brother, Robert, would remain loyal to the king. It seems likely that Walleran was driven now by pragmatism rather than any genuine desire to abandon Stephen or promote the Empress's cause. Robert's lands were primarily in England, based on their father's earldom of Leicester, but as Count of Moulins, Walleran had significant holdings in Normandy that were coming under threat from Geoffrey of Anjou. His own English earldom lay jammed up against Empress Matilda's territories, and if he continued to oppose her, he would be on the front line of the fighting. Resisting her in England in the name of a king she held prisoner might be enough to see his Norman properties become the focus of unwanted attention from Count Geoffrey. It seems likely that the Beaumont twins divided their loyalties to keep a foot in each camp, relying on the ability of whichever of them had selected the winning side to preserve the holdings of the other when the dust settled. Nevertheless, a Beaumont twin, so central to Stephen's efforts to retain control of both Normandy and England at the Empress's side, was a strong signal that her faction was on the very brink of victory. King David of Scotland came south to join in his niece's triumph. He was confirmed in his own English earldom of Huntingdon, but the relationship seems to have soured quite quickly as Empress Matilda tried to establish her authority, but managed only to appear aloof and haughty. The writer of the Gesta Stephani complained that she did not rise respectfully as she should have when King David, Earl Robert, or Bishop Henry entered her presence. This is another peculiar issue of her sex and the perception that women should be submissive and subservient to men. No king would have been expected to rise when an earl or bishop came to see him. It was this kind of expectation that Empress Matilda needed to find an alternative to, but which she seems instead to have railed and thrashed against. The same writer complained further that the Empress no longer relied on their advice as she should have and had promised them, but arranged everything as she herself thought fit and according to her own arbitrary will. Such strength and determination to impose personal authority could be admired in a man. Emanating from a woman, it was a source of confusion, consternation and even fear. William of Malmesbury seems to have believed that Earl Robert was increasingly excluded too, or else sought to excuse his patron from the approaching problems. He wrote that if other members of his party had trusted his restraint and wisdom, they would not afterwards have endured such a turn of ill fortune, suggesting that there was some truth in the story that the Empress was not listening to advice any longer. Problems with the alliances Empress Matilda tried to forge began to show almost immediately, and she was forced to pick sides amongst her own adherents, or supposed adherents. King David asserted his right to appoint a new Bishop of Durham to the vacant see, claiming that Durham and the surrounding area fell under his jurisdiction. The King of Scots wanted the post for his own Chancellor, William Comyn. The chapter at Durham was horrified and wrote to the Empress and Bishop Henry for aid. The bishop immediately responded by supporting the right of the chapter to elect their own bishop and instructed William Comyn that he was not to take up the see unless he was legitimately elected. Empress Matilda immediately overruled Bishop Henry and ignored the chapter's objections. She recognised William Comyn as bishop-elect and began plans to invest him herself as soon as she had been crowned. Not only did the Empress alienate a potentially vital ally, she outraged the entire church by refusing them free elections. Furthermore, she effectively recognised the right of her uncle King David to control swathes of the north of England, something that was unlikely to be well received in the north and which smacked of abandoning a section of her people. In attempting to assert some dominance, the Empress only managed to appear subservient to King David and an enemy of the church. It wasn't a good start. There was no such trouble with the appointment of the new Bishop of London. Empress Matilda wanted the post for her father's former Master of the Writing Office, Robert de Siglio, who was now a monk at Henry I's foundation at Reading Abbey. Robert was put forward by the Empress, duly elected and blessed by Theobald. Although Stephen later resented having the Empress's man in such a position, he found himself unable to remove Robert, because his election had been entirely proper and legal. Durham was evidently a very different matter, in which the Empress had tried to subvert a free election to mollify her uncle. It may be significant that at this moment, Norman barons such as Jean de Mayer, Alexander de Bohun, Guy of Sablé, and Pagan of Clairvaux began to appear as witnesses to Empress Matilda's charters at Oxford. Their presence suggests a degree of contact with her husband that must have sought to relay information about their respective achievements in England and Normandy. It is possible that Geoffrey of Anjou was trying to impose his will on his wife at this moment so that he might have some interest in the Kingdom of England, though his actions and attitude seem to consistently display a spectacular disinterest in anything beyond Normandy. Count Geoffrey had taken a long time to make any headway in the duchy, and his latest and greatest success had come off the back of his wife and her half-brother's success in England. He was willing to take his time to get a firm grip on Normandy, and may have felt that trying to support his wife in England was a step too far, that he would overreach himself and let what he had gained slip through his fingers. Indeed, he might have sent his wife on her way to England to indulge her and get her out of the way while he set about trying to subdue Normandy. If he had, then her success was an unlooked-for boon. Both Henry I and Stephen had gained control of Normandy by first establishing themselves as kings of England. If the Empress saw that well enough, Geoffrey didn't care. He didn't wish to claim Normandy as an extension of the English crown, or in fact, in any way on behalf of his wife. He wasn't interested in being the Duchess's husband, or the Queen's husband. He wanted to be Duke of Normandy in his own right, and nothing would shake his focus from that goal. Some final negotiations for the reception of Empress Matilda into London must have been made at St Albans, where she was warmly welcomed. Her proximity to the city suggests that she had finally tired of waiting and decided to move closer to force the hand of the citizens. An agreement was reached, perhaps with the weight of Geoffrey de Mandeville placed firmly behind it. Around the 21st of June, 1141, Empress Matilda, Lady of the English, was welcomed into the capital city of her kingdom and began to prepare for a coronation that would secure her position. Almost immediately, the Empress blew away any goodwill she might have gathered. This time, it wasn't really an issue of her sex, but entirely one of her attitude. Rather than wait for her coronation to be completed before venting whatever frustration she felt against the Londoners, she seems to have believed her position already unassailable, and the Empress began to make unnecessary mistakes. These were undoubtedly the things over which William of Malmesbury thought Earl Robert was being disregarded. The Jester Stefani recorded that Empress Matilda arrived in London at the invitation of the city. She came with a large army, apparently with the consent of the citizens, who believed that they had attained to joyous days of peace and quietness, and that the calamities of the kingdom had taken a turn for the better. Whether this is true or not is impossible to tell. The city may have realised that it had held out and slowed the Empress down for as long as was possible without risking an attack. The power that Geoffrey de Mandeville was accruing in the Empress's efforts to gain entry threatened the desired independence of the capital, which was claiming the status of a commune, and the citizens may have resented Geoffrey's promotions and realised that they needed to cut their losses and make peace with the Empress. In turn, Empress Matilda must have feared that the city still harboured some loyalty to Stephen, which she expected them to demonstrate convincingly had been transferred to her. They tried to demand Stephen's release at Winchester and had been uncooperative ever since, so any suspicion was not unreasonable. As her father had often done, she turned to financial punishments to secure loyalty and deprive her potential enemies of funds with which to oppose her. Even as London seemed to rejoice in welcoming the new Lady of the English, the smiles, real or pretend, were wiped from the faces of the citizens. Matilda sent for the wealthiest men in London and ordered them to pay vast sums of money to her as a tax. She asked, not with unassuming gentleness, but with a voice of authority, to the shock of the gathered well-to-do of London. Those before her spluttered their objections. They had no money to give after all the upheavals of recent years. They assured her that when the nation was in a more settled state, they would gladly provide her with whatever sum she demanded, but for now, the men protested. They simply couldn't afford it. Empress Matilda, her worst suspicions appearing to be true, with a grim look, her forehead wrinkled into a frown, every trace of a woman's gentleness removed from her face, blazed into unbearable fury, saying that many times the people of London had made very large contributions to the king, that they had lavished their wealth on strengthening him and weakening her, that they had previously conspired with her enemies for her hurt, and therefore it was not just to spare them in any respect or make the smallest reduction in the money demanded. The Empress was enraged at the refusal, and if what the writer of the Gesta Stephani reports is correct, saw through their assurances of loyalty, fearing that they refused her because they remained loyal to Stephen. There was feeling on both sides that she'd blown it. William of Malmesbury complained, "Behold, when it was thought that she was about to gain possession of the whole of England, everything was changed." To make matters worse, Queen Matilda interjected, doubtless picking her moment to emphasise the differences between the two women and their approaches. The author of the Gesta Stephani interestingly describes the Queen as a woman of subtlety and a man's resolution, perhaps meant to mean that she represented everything that the Empress was not. As she had done at Winchester, Queen Matilda demonstrated her own intricate understanding of how a woman could operate the levers of power in England, just as the Empress threw a wrench into her own. Messengers arrived in London from the Queen to request from the Empress the release of her husband from a terrible imprisonment, but not to return to the crown or indeed to any of his possessions. All that she asked for, aside from Stephen's freedom, was the return to their son Eustace of his rightful inheritance in Boulogne, which he should have held through the Queen from her father. It was a layered request that could only have been designed to detonate at every level of Empress Matilda's cause, exposing her flaws and widening the cracks in her support. It was as devilishly clever as it was perfectly timed. The Queen demonstrated to the men in London and around the Empress precisely how a woman was expected to act, not shouting and demanding money, but interceding to find peace and resolution. This was a woman the men of power could understand and deal with. Her request to release Stephen was a plea for mercy from the Empress. Making no mention of him returning as king didn't preclude the possibility, but she implied that he would simply retire into obscurity. The Empress could never agree to this petition. It would have been a death knell to her chances of reigning peacefully. Her father had kept his own brother imprisoned for 28 years until the latter's death, so she can have had few qualms about doing the same to her cousin if it kept to the throne. But a woman in power was supposed to represent the exercise of mercy, to encourage it in her husband under more usual circumstances. The Queen was forcing Empress Matilda to refuse to give mercy when it was asked for, pushing her even further from the accepted norms of behaviour for her sex. Asking for Eustace's inheritance from her father, the county of Boulogne, and nothing else, was perhaps the most ingenious trick of all. It was something the Empress could agree to, but the Queen must have gambled on her rejection of the petition wholesale. Queen Matilda did not demand the return of all Stephen's lands in England and Normandy, which he had held under Henry I, nor even did she ask for these for her oldest son and heir. All she wanted was her father's county to pass to Eustace, from grandfather to grandson. After all, she'd only been a custodian, her husband holding her in trust for their son, because she was just a woman. Queen Matilda must have known the Empress was likely to refuse, given the mood she was in, but denying a rightful inheritance was a dangerous precedent to set that placed everyone with property to leave behind on edge. If the new regime didn't adhere to the basic, accepted rules of inheritance, it would be hard for most to attach themselves to it with any certainty. The final ticking bomb was the insinuation in the Queen's plea that a woman could not rule. She wanted her father's inheritance to pass to her son, ignoring any rights she may have had. The notion perhaps mirrored a lingering preference for Empress Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, to be the focus of her efforts. Some might have felt far more comfortable with the idea of Empress Matilda transmitting a claim to Henry from her father than the notion of her actually ruling. At the very least, it kept the Empress's supporters discussing the merits of alternatives and the problems in her claim to a right to rule, dividing her support. As her personality began to become an issue, turning many away from her, an alternative would increase in appeal. If Queen Matilda were able to demonstrate the ability to act impeccably on her husband's behalf, then Empress Matilda's behaviour would seem all the more jarring and unacceptable in comparison. Every aspect of the Queen's brief and apparent desperate plea was designed to tear away at the Empress's support, and it worked spectacularly. The Queen's messengers were harangued and offered only insults for their troubles. The Empress refused to grant anything that the Queen requested and sent her envoys away in a rage. Bishop Henry seems to have backed the request that Eustace should be permitted to inherit Boulogne, and he was angered by the Empress's refusal. As at Winchester, it's tempting to see the Queen and the Bishop stage managing the opportunity for the Empress to expose her own flaws, her able to offer a contrast to the Empress, and him able to advise on the perfect moment to move. Bishop Henry withdrew from the Empress's court, and William of Malmesbury saw at this moment he became disaffected with her cause. He reportedly met the Queen at Guildford, and they had a family summit to decide what to do. It's perhaps naive to believe that they had not been in communication throughout the spring and summer, but William thought the Empress had fatally wounded her own hopes after her arrival in London. He saw that all the barons of England had kept their faith with her, but she had broken hers, being unable to show restraint in the enjoyment of what she had gained. It seemed that even those who sympathised with her cause found her to be a poor winner. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that. Books available now to buy online and in bookshops when we can get out there. Thank you very much.